Story 1. One of my children wandered out of his bedroom at about 1 a.m. and told me he could not sleep because the shadows are angry. Thanks, child. Now that is something I am going to think about forever. Story 2. I was babysitting my cousin, and her bedroom door swung open wider on its own. I said, "Well, that was creepy," and slammed the door shut. She said, "Hey, why did you slam the door on Grandma?" Our same grandma who died 3 months before she was born. Story 3. My daughter once asked, "Is today the day the glass breaks?" Confused, I said no. 10 minutes later, the living room window shattered from a stray cricket ball. Story 4. Not my child, but I am much older than my sister. One day, when she was about 4 or 5 years old, we were playing in her room. She stopped mid-sentence and stared out her window. She looked scared for a second and then just annoyed. I did not see anything unusual, so I asked her what was wrong, and we had the following conversation. "The tall man is back." "Oh, do you want to go somewhere else?" "No, let's just play." "Is he scary?" Annoyed sigh, "No, he just looks at me." "He just looks?" "Yeah. And sometimes he goes down the hall like a hoverboard." "Oh, well, okay. How about we go play in the living room?" Story 5. I was reading to my niece in her bed once. She was probably around 3 years old, which is totally normal. Then she suddenly looked into the corner of the room and said, "Shoo, please stop screaming. I can't hear the story." Then she went back to normal. We finished the book in the living room. Story 6. Is mommy home? I saw her walk by the door. My wife was working nights, and my daughter said she saw her walk by the bedroom doorway earlier than she would have been home. I told her maybe it was a fly or something she saw move out of the corner of her eye. But then she said, "No, it was this color," and pointed at her arm. The creepy thing is that I had been seeing things out of the corner of my eye a few times that night, but didn't say anything about it. Story 7. Not a parent, but my nephew is at the stage where everyone who looks remotely like my brother is called Dada. My brother is tall with light brown hair, so there are a lot of men who look like him to the little boy. It always cracks my sister-in-law and me up when we go to the store and he points at everyone saying Dada. A few weeks ago, I was watching him for a few hours while his parents were at an event, and I was getting him settled in his crib, tucked into his sleep sack. Just as I straightened up, his eye line went from my face to somewhere above my shoulder, as if he was looking at someone tall standing behind me, and he smiled and said, "Dada." I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Scared me very much. Story 8. My dad passed away after a long, painful struggle with cancer when my son was around 18 months old. I was still grieving a few months later when my son woke from a nap, and I went to his room to get him. When I opened the door, he pointed behind me and said, "Who is that man?" We were alone in the house, but I looked behind me anyway and saw nothing. I asked, "What does he look like?" My son answered, "He looks like the sun." A few days later, we were playing with his toy telephone, having pretend conversations. My son passed me the phone and said, "It is Papa." My eyes welled up instantly, and I asked him, "What does he say?" My son paused as if he was listening and said, "I love you." After another pause, he said, "I miss you." I am usually not the type to believe in the supernatural, but this experience made me believe he came to say goodbye to us and let us know he was okay. Story 9. When my older daughter was 3, she colored all of her dolls to look like they had been beaten or cut, and then covered their eyes with bandages. When I asked her why she did it, she said all her dolls were dead and wanted me to see what he did. The only people watching her at that point were us and my parents, and neither of us have that kind of household, so I do not know where it came from. Story 10. My son, who was around 7 at the time and my only child, would play in his room and have vivid conversations. I just brushed it off as imaginary play, but these conversations were about our family. One day, out of curiosity, I asked who he was talking to, and he told me his sister who was in heaven came to play with him and described what she looked like. I had just had a miscarriage a few months prior to this, and he described a baby girl that would have looked like me. Then one day, he randomly came to me and said, "Mommy, my sister isn't coming back anymore. She says I have a new sister coming to play with me. It creeped me out, but I found out a week or two later that I was pregnant, and I ended up having a girl. Story 11. When my daughter was born, my 2-year-old son, the sweetest boy ever, was holding her. He looked at me seriously and said, "We do not strangle our baby sister." Story 12. We have no one in our family who has this name or anything close. No friends, etc. Our 2-year-old kept saying Yaya. Yaya in my room. Yaya there. And the worst, Yaya no like that. Story 13. A child told me they wanted to cut my face off and wear it because they love me so much. I still have my face. Story 14. In the middle of the night, my son came into my room, stood in the doorway, and asked, "Are we still playing the game?" Then he turned and walked away. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Story 15. When my daughter was 5, she told me a man woke her up and said she had to choose whether to go up to the sky or down to the ground. We are not religious. I told her she could choose to just stay with me instead. Thankfully, he has not presented her with any other ultimatums. Story 16. Where is my other mother? The one who was before you? Said my toddler quizzically while we were playing. That made me break out in goosebumps. Story 17. Not as creepy as some I have heard. But when our son was around 2 to 2.5 years old, we got a Roomba and he named it Blinky. One day, probably closer to 3 years old, he became very scared of the Roomba. When I tried to talk to him about it, he told me, "Blinky sees you. Blinky is always watching." Story 18. I was having severe, hospital-level abdominal pain and nausea while being evaluated for known gallbladder issues, wondering if I had an obstruction again. It felt just like before. I was scared, in agony, and dreading moving, even to call for help. My child was 5 years old and had come into my bed without my knowing before I was woken by pain. Out of nowhere, from sound asleep, he said, "Mommy, you need to stand up now." So I did. It hurt so badly. He was already asleep again. I stood for a minute, and as I did, the pain that was cutting through my core to my spine slowly disappeared. A few minutes later, the nausea went away. I don't know what it was. I didn't have any gas or anything simple to explain it like gas pain. It was just gone. I didn't even know he was there until he spoke. My intuition thinks one of my known stones was stuck and he helped me clear it somehow, or maybe it was just a spasm. I'll never know. Story 19. My 3-year-old won't stop saying there's a ghost in the bathroom, specifically in the bathtub. He loves taking baths, so I don't think he's just afraid of the room or tub, but I can't figure out what he's talking about. When he talks about ghosts, he usually means the white sheet over the head Halloween type of ghost. For example, he puts a blanket over his head and says, "Mommy, I'm a spooky ghost." I've held him up and told him to point to the ghost, but he just points to a corner of the tub with nothing there. When I get close to the wall, he says, "Right there," and says he's touching the ghost, but his hand is just suspended in the air, not touching anything. Story 20. My daughter was 3 years old. She looked up from playing, waved at an empty wall and said, "Bye." About an hour later, I received a message that my aunt had passed away that afternoon. She was the closest person I had to a grandmother, but she never met my children because we lived in different countries. I am not religious, but I still feel like she came to check in on us before going. Story 21. When my son was 2, he suddenly had an imaginary friend named Boy. According to him, Boy came home with us from behind the shed at my friend's house. Boy used to play with him and he talked to Boy. We had to set a seat at the table and a spot in the car for Boy. Occasionally, I would ask him where Boy was, and he would say things like, "Oh, he's walking right behind you." Boy eventually went away after more than a year of being around. My son is 7 now, and if I ask him about Boy, he says he does not want to talk about it. Story 22. Between the ages of 3 and 4, my daughter had an imaginary friend she called Otro, which we learned much later means other in Spanish. She started using Spanish words from time to time that she said Otro taught her. Story 23. When my daughter was a toddler, she would often cry and point to the dark corner in the hallway at night. Then we moved away from that place when she was almost 4 years old. Years later, we drove by that place, and I asked her if she remembered anything about it. She said she remembered a tall, dark man standing in the corner in the hallway. Story 24. When my eldest was still in diapers, we lived in a house where one room in particular creeped me out. One morning, I was in that room's closet, sorting fresh laundry and hanging clothes. My daughter toddled into the room, and as she walked closer, I knew she needed a diaper change. I grabbed a small portable mat and diaper supplies from the same closet and laid it on the floor, just outside the closet. She knew the routine. She lay down on the mat, and I started the diaper change. With my back to the closet, on my knees, body half in and half out of the closet, my daughter started telling me, "No." I thought I had accidentally pinched her with the diaper tab. So I said, "Oh, no. I'm so sorry." She said again, more firmly this time, "No." I was confused, so I checked to make sure the diaper wasn't too tight. Then she yelled, "No, no, no." I didn't understand what was happening, so I asked, "No? What's wrong?" She pointed and said, "Not you. Him. Be nice to mommy." I realized she wasn't pointing at me but behind me. The hair on the back of my neck rose instantly. I picked my daughter up like a football, diaper hanging off, and ran. I must have looked like the Heisman Trophy. Every instinct told me to get outside, into the sunlight. I don't even remember how I got outside. That was one moment that stands out. Story 25. I was putting my daughter to bed when she was around 3, and she said, "Mummy, why did you take so long to be ready for me? I'm glad I picked you to be my mummy, but you made me wait so long." My other daughter, when she was 2, said something like, "I remember when I was your mummy and other daughter was your brother." That was a long time ago. On more than one occasion, she has also said, "Mummy, when will I see my other mummy again?" Creepy little weirdos. Story 26. We stayed in an old country house, and during the entire time, one of my children kept saying that she lived near here with her first family. Throughout the week, she referred to me as her second mom. It was really strange. She never mentioned her first family again after we left. Story 27. Last year, my daughter was 6 years old. I was in the bathroom, and she was in her bedroom when I had the sensation of someone walking past the bathroom door, like a shadow passing by. My daughter came out of her room and asked, "Who was that?" I asked what she meant, and she said, "Who was the pretend person who just walked past?" I asked how it was a pretend person, and she said they were all gray like a shadow but looked like a person. I keep telling myself it was just a strange coincidence. Story 28. Other parent. "Okay, but why did you scratch Quinn?" Hippie toddler. "He didn't have wings to rip off." Context. We had just found out my toddler, both the youngest and tallest in his pre-kindergarten class, was being bullied. He scratched the kid. We assumed that was the reason. Nope. Our boy, who was literally thrown off a slide and would not snitch, lost his composure when he saw the bully go after a butterfly. Watch the sweet ones. They feel big things too and have less practice holding back when they finally snap. Story 29. On my first international flight, I loudly asked my mother, "Are we disintegrating yet?" Instead of descending. 30 years later, it is still brought up. Story 30. My then 3-year-old was having problems sleeping and said it was because the black flyer thing had been visiting him at night. When asked what it looked like, he described a ring wraith-type creature that flew around his room in the dark. He ended the description with, "He doesn't have eyes, but he can still see you." We let him sleep with his lamp on after that. Story 31. My daughter did something that kind of worried me when she was a toddler. We were visiting my parents. She looked right at a rocking chair, waved, said, "Hi, Hugh," and went back to playing. That was my godfather Hugh's rocking chair. He had been dead for over a decade at that point. Story 32. Not my child, but at the library where I work, I once heard a 3-year-old with tears in his eyes say to his mom, "I didn't mean to say that. It was just the bad man talking." Story 33. When my son was about 5, we lived in a house that had a finished attic where the kids' bedroom was. I was walking behind him up the stairs because we were going to clean. He stopped suddenly on the steps, turned around to me, and his face went pale. I asked, "What's wrong, honey?" He said, "I don't like the souls." Story 34. We were a guest choir invited to perform at an old church. My 5-year-old son walked in and started talking about all the people who died in a fire inside. The fire happened 40 years before I was born. Story 35. Not my child because I was the child. I often saw things as a child. My parents told me that once when I was 5 years old, I was sitting on the rug with my Barbies while they watched television. They said my head snapped up and my eyes became distant before I said, "Someone died in here," while looking past them. Apparently, I snapped out of it after a few seconds and went right back to playing. Basically, I was the kid you see in horror movies. Story 36. My 3-year-old son, playing in the bath with some PJ Masks figures, held one of them underwater with some force. "Good night, Owlette." "Good night." Story 37. During a long, boring road trip with my son, who was 7 at the time, to take him to Nana's. "Son, Daddy, let's play Simon Says." Simon Says, "Touch your nose." Me, "Okay." "Son." Simon Says, "Make a funny face." Me, "Okay." "Son." Simon Says, "Rip out all your veins." Me, Story 38. I fell asleep in our living room in our recliner watching television with my wife, who was on the couch. I had a vivid dream of waking up in the same place and talking with her about normal things. Nothing had changed in the surroundings. But then I saw a large shadowy figure move behind my wife on the couch and head down the hall toward my daughter's room. I started yelling, and my wife ended up shaking me awake. I attributed it to just a bad dream. The next morning, my 6-year-old daughter came running into our room crying and screaming that she saw a strange shadow moving in her room. I don't really believe in ghosts, but that experience had me on edge for a long time. Story 39. Not my child, but I remember hanging out with a friend of mine when his little brother walked up to him and asked, "Do you remember when I was big and you were little?" Not exactly creepy per se, but it was strange. Story 40. She was barely 2 years old. As clear as day, she said as we watched a butterfly float by. "Next time I want to come back as that." My jaw dropped. We are not religious or spiritual, or at least we were not. I have been questioning everything since. Story 41. Kissing my 2-year-old son goodnight one night, and after saying, "I love you, bud," he looked up at me and said, "I am going to eat your bones." Story 42. I've got 3 funny stories. At 14 months old, I had my daughter on my back while we were hiking in the remote hilly woods near my mom's house. My daughter, who could maybe string together 2 words at the time, started repeatedly saying, "Bear." Luckily, there was no bear. At 18 months, we were walking through our neighborhood and past the forested edge. My daughter pointed into the woods and said, "Hiding people. Hiding peeping people." We chuckled nervously. At around 2.5 years old, we took my daughter on a night walk in the neighborhood. We do these frequently because she enjoys them. We rounded the bend from our house and were chatting when our daughter interrupted us. She pointed into the distant street and said, "Doggies. Doggies." We looked but couldn't see anything. Just quiet, still darkness. "I see doggies there, but they are not doggies. And they are running here fast. And they are scary." That one definitely scared us. So we scooped her up and quickly went back to the house. One more story. My daughter and I were sleeping at my parents' old house, which was an interesting place, to say the least. In the middle of the night, I heard my 2-year-old start grumbling and then say, "Pretend there's ghost. Pretend there's ghost." More whining and grumbling. Not pretend. Silence for a bit. I get out. Believe it or not, this was one of the calmest incidents at that house, so I just chuckled and went back to sleep. Story 43. Not my child but me. When I was little, I used to talk about my grandfather, my mother's father who passed before I was born, coming to visit me. I would tell stories about him, things that were correct, but she swears I didn't hear them from someone else. I would also tell stories from her childhood as if they had happened to me. Again, stories she was sure I had never heard before. I grew out of it and don't remember any of it, but I did have a very strange incident later in life, maybe at 18 or 19 years old. My mom and I were out together, and a man walked by smoking a pipe. As soon as I smelled it, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of intense nostalgia. I really can't describe it. The emotions were so strong they made me tear up. Next, I saw my mom walking up to him and asking if he was smoking a certain brand of tobacco. When he said yes, she asked how he knew. She said it was the only kind her father smoked and she would recognize it anywhere. As soon as she said that, everything felt right. I knew deep down that was correct, but I know for a fact I had never smelled it before. No one I have ever known smoked a pipe, and he was gone long enough that it is unlikely I would have picked up the smell in my grandmother's house. It is the weirdest thing I have ever experienced, and I genuinely have no explanation for it. Story 44. Not my kids, but I work with children in a daycare center. 5 years ago, a 3-year-old was playing and talking alone in a ball pool we have. I asked her who she was speaking to, and she said, "It's Robert. He is just here." There were no children named Robert, and she was looking at empty space. It can be pretty scary, but I know children have imaginary friends, so it didn't scare me. 3 years later, another child was playing in the same ball pool and talking with Robert too. I still don't know how it is possible, and I think I don't want to know. Story 45. When my nephew was 3, his mom was pushing him on a swing. He turned to her and said, "Mommy, when I died, I was in a boat and it turned over. Then it sank in the water, and I couldn't breathe anymore. I don't want that to happen again." Then he went on his merry way swinging. She got him to retell it to me later that day, and the way he said it was so serious and dark. It was spooky. He also once mentioned how he doesn't like his sister who has red eyes and hangs out in the bathroom. He calls all kids he meets brother or sister. It's pretty adorable until he's talking about some creepy, red-eyed ghost child. Story 46. I scared my mother when I was about 3 years old because I said, "Mommy, when I was a soldier, I got shot and died in the war." Story 47. I posted this for a similar question a few hours ago. It happened to a friend a few years ago. His daughter was 5 at the time. He woke up at 3 a.m. to find her in his room staring at him from the corner of the bed. Once he got past the initial alarm, he put her back to sleep. As he was hugging her, she said, "You smell different when you're scared." Needless to say, he was creeped out. Story 48. My son used to have friends who would hang around. 2 of them he called Jim and the lady. I asked what they looked like, and he said they had boo-boos on their heads. The scariest part was when he looked under my bed one day and said the lady was under there. One night, he was sound asleep, then suddenly sat up and told me, "Don't look behind you," before lying back down and falling asleep again. Behind me was the window, and my curtain rod had been broken at the time, so I had nothing covering it. Needless to say, I did not turn around. Story 49. We rented a house from my father-in-law for a couple of months when my son, an only child at that point, was about 3, and we were waiting for a house purchase to go through. One night, we had gone to bed, and shortly after, we heard him talking. I got up to bring him back to bed. He was standing at his door, where an infant gate was fitted to prevent him from getting out. I asked him why he was out of bed. He pointed behind me and said, "I'm talking to the little girl." We later found out a young girl had died in the house about 50 years before. Interestingly, our cat also refused to go into 2 rooms in that house. My in-laws live there now, and their dog won't enter the same rooms. Story 50. I work with children and found out I was pregnant very early, but I had not told anyone. I was playing with a small group of children when one stopped and looked at me. She said, "You have a baby in your tummy." I was a little shocked but played it down. I replied, "Do I? What makes you think that?" She looked me straight in the eye and whispered, "I can hear their voice." Story 51. My son, who was 3 at the time, looked at me very seriously and said, "In 127 days, we will all be dead." It didn't happen, but I marked July 10th on my phone calendar with a reminder, "Be careful." Story 52. When my daughter was around 3 years old, my wife, and I were hanging out in our room. She pointed at our closet and said, An angel. We hadn't talked about angels with her or taken her to church, so we weren't sure where she had heard that. I walked her to the closet, and she kept pointing to the same spot, saying there was an angel. We decided to let it go because there was no one in the closet, and if there was an angel, that wouldn't be such a bad thing, right? Although that closet is about 5 feet from my side of the bed, and I would wake up in the middle of the night staring into this dark closet, thinking even if there was an angel, why would it just be sitting in the closet staring at us? I didn't sleep well. A week later, my daughter and I were in the bedroom, and I asked her if the angel was still there. She said, "Yes, it's right there," and pointed at the same spot in the closet. We didn't talk to her about it for a few weeks because we figured if we didn't discuss it, it wouldn't become a big thing. A few weeks later, I couldn't help myself and carried her into the closet. I asked her, "Is the angel still in here?" She said, "Yes, right here." I asked, "What is their name?" She said, "I don't know." I asked, "What color are their eyes?" She said, "Orange." I asked, "What are they wearing?" She said, "They are all orange with a tail like Daniel Tiger." My blood ran cold, and chills ran down my back. That was no angel. I immediately took her out of the room. I researched how to bless a room, and I prayed in the closet, telling whatever it was that it wasn't welcome in our home. We didn't talk about it for a couple of months, and one day I asked her about the angel. She had no idea what I was talking about. So whether it was something she made up or a demon in my closet, either way, it was gone. We have since moved away and have never had any similar issues. Story 53. When my daughter was a baby, she often made a sound while sleeping that sounded exactly like the boy in The Grudge. I had a lot of sleepless nights because of her. Story 54. My son was in my bedroom when he was about 3 and was staring toward the wall when he started giggling. He began waving at the wall, and I asked him what he was doing. He told me, "The man in Mama's room says hello to Mama." We lived alone. I asked him where the man was, and he pointed at the spot he was looking up. He kept giggling and said the man was funny. Years later, it still creeps me out. There were a few other similar incidents over the years, so I tell myself it's just my friend who passed, checking in on us from time to time. Story 55. Our backyard backs up to a cemetery. One day, my 2.5-year-old looked out the back window, pointed and said, "Look at all the people." Story 56. We were cuddling our 8-month-old on the couch, getting ready for bed. He was a great sleeper, loved his nursery, and never had a problem going to sleep. I said, "Let's go to bed," and he pointed down the hallway. He froze up like an exorcist baby and started babbling, "No, no, no." He was literally frozen flat as an ironing board. My husband and I were spinning out. His eyes looked terrified. I turned on the hallway light, and he was still stiff and looked terrified. I carried him into the kitchen, and he snapped out of it. It was weird because the hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt scared and uneasy. He slept in the fold-out cot in our room that night. The next night, he went to bed as normal. Kids are strange. Story 57. Staring into the empty corner of the room calmly while playing with his little truck, he said, "Oh, he has arms today." Story 58. Maybe not creepy, but gave me chills. This was the first of several surprising things he said, but it seems to have calmed down now. My son was 2 when I got pregnant with our second child. We did tell him I was pregnant, but he honestly didn't seem to understand or care. We lost that baby right at 10 or 11 weeks. It was a traumatic experience that lasted about a month. In the hustle and bustle, I genuinely do not know if we told him the baby was no longer there. Anyway, fast forward about 18 months and I'm heavily pregnant with our next baby. He would have been almost 4. We're in the car coming home from daycare, and I'm just taking a moment to talk to him about the baby coming soon, and he pipes up, "Mom, is this baby going to come home and live with us?" And I said, "Well, that's the plan, bud." And he goes, "Well, because my brother didn't. He came and told me that he couldn't stay with us and he was going to go live in the clouds and that he'd watch over me." I was floored, because we are not a religious family, to the point where I watch what I say regarding anything like that. There is no way any of us would have said anything about the baby passing away and going to live in the clouds. Additionally, and take this with a grain of salt, but there are some comforting beliefs in communities around pregnancy loss that say things like, the baby's soul will come back in a future pregnancy, which can be comforting. I never really felt like that applied to me and these babies though. It just didn't resonate. So to hear that my son thought the first one was a boy, which I also thought but never confirmed, and then my next child is a girl, I was a little taken aback. He also had key thoughts and experiences about both of my grandmothers passing away, which was also wild to me, especially because he was more articulate about those. Kids are strange. Story 59. One time I was putting her to bed. She looked and pointed to an empty corner of the ceiling and said, "Who is that?" I wanted to run out of there so fast, but had to stay calm. Story 60. Obligatory, not apparent, but I worked at a summer camp and was playing dead, long story. A girl came up to me and said, "You're not dead. If you were dead, you'd be twitching." Terrifying to hear from a 7-year-old. Story 61. When I was little, I had a picture book with a different bug for every letter of the alphabet. One day, I told my mom I was scared of my bug book and didn't want to read it anymore because I saw a scorpion. She told me I was being silly. Then I went to school, and she found a dead scorpion under my bed. Story 62. My little cousin said to a stranger, "You are not going to make it." The man said, "What was that, little guy?" Cousin said, "Time is up," and walked off. Story 63. My son was about 4 or 5 when, apropos of nothing, he said, "I was a cosmonaut before I was born." I was half listening and said, "Oh, you were an astronaut?" "No," he said, "a cosmonaut." He was extremely insistent. He had been on a bit of a space kick, so I figured one of his books brought up the term. I looked, and none of them mentioned the term cosmonaut. For a moment, it sounded like he was casually mentioning a past life. Even weirder, he and his younger sister both claimed that they knew each other and were friends who played together before they were born. Story 64. I do not personally find this creepy, but other people have. When my middle child was about 3, we were watching videos for the older children's science homework. A video of a young woman in a Faraday cage played, and my middle child pointed to the television and said, "That was me. I was a big girl before, and the electricity got in my hands. Then I was a baby again." Story 65. Mummy, why does that man have horns? My 5-year-old asked me as we walked over a small bridge passing a random man. Story 66. A 2.5-year-old toddler furiously rubbed my cheeks the other day and said, "I want your skin." I still do not know what it meant. Story 67. Sharing one I did as a kid. At around 3 years old, I once mentioned to my mom and her boyfriend at the time that I had lived in Flint, Michigan before. I said I was retired but previously worked as a tool and die manufacturer or something similar in machining. I keep forgetting exactly what my mother said I said. I have no recollection of bringing this up. I have no clue how at that time I would have even known Flint, Michigan existed since my earliest memories of television, which is where I would logically assume I heard it mentioned. I was born and grew up in Southern California and watched a lot of cartoons, Lassie, The Bill Cosby Show, Knight Rider, and The A-Team. I especially have no idea how I would know anything about machining, let alone tool and die manufacturing. It is a strange coincidence. My mom's boyfriend grew up around Michigan, so he started asking questions to try and verify what I was saying, but he did not get much out of me. While I am not one to completely believe in supernatural things, I imagine if there is any truth to what I was talking about, then perhaps I had spent most of my adult life in machining and finally retired, only to pass early into retirement. So past life me was all, no, forget that, I am going back as soon as possible. I know I am not the only kid to start randomly talking about apparent past lives either, and it is an aspect of supernatural incidents I find absolutely fascinating. Story 68. When she was 5, a friend of mine told her mother that she was never coming back to this place and that this would be her last time there. Her mother was taken aback by this, as there was no context for such a comment. My friend grew up to be a devout Buddhist, and her greatest desire is to not come back to this place. Story 69. When I was a few months pregnant with my second child, my son, who was 3 at the time, started crying very hard in a very emotional way. It happened completely out of nowhere while I was folding laundry and watching cartoons with him. I asked him what was wrong, and he asked me where his baby sister was. He was sobbing, and I tried to calm him down. He told me he needed his baby sister because they came to me together since their other parents hurt them. He started crying almost hysterically. I was freaked out by this point, just holding him and trying to calm him down. He kept saying they hurt her arms and hands really badly. Then they hurt him. Everything went dark, and then he came to me. I was a pregnant hormonal mess at this point and wondered if anything we had watched had anything like that in it. I homeschooled him, so it wasn't like we went anywhere else during the day. I calmed him down and tried to put it to the back of my mind. Then I found out I was having a baby girl. We were overjoyed. When she was born, my son was obsessed with making sure her hands were okay every morning. When my daughter started talking, she began calling me her good mama, not her bad mama. She would, and still does, say certain phrases that used to slightly weird me out, like, "I'm going to stay with you forever," and "please don't leave, stay my mama." These were unprompted and completely out of the blue. My daughter got to the point where she said she had a bad mama who hurt her really badly, so she turned into a ghost and found me and went into my tummy, her words. This stuff genuinely freaks me out. I'm not religious, but I'm somewhat spiritual. Even if it is all a coincidence, I feel like I have to push myself to be a better parent for my babies. There's a drive that doesn't let me just coast by. I feel a need to do these things for my kids. Story 70. My girls went through a phase where they would blame small mishaps, such as messes and misplaced items, on Mr. Nobody. Story 71. Not a parent, but my little brother was about 3 when he would talk about his grandmother who flies in the sky with her garden. Our grandmother passed away shortly before my mother found out she was pregnant with him. Her garden was her happy place, and she had won several local awards for it over the years, but he had no way to know that. I like to think that she was watching over him. Story 72. We bought a piano at an estate sale. Due to the logistics involved in transporting it to our house, I had a lot of contact with the deceased woman's daughter. She spoke frequently about her late mother, how much she loved the piano, and how she enjoyed playing for children. I did not talk to my daughter, who was 3 at the time, about any of this because, fortunately, she had not yet experienced the death of a pet or loved one. However, after a couple of months, she asked why the old woman who came and sat at the piano never played. She then described a woman who resembled the photos the daughter had shown me of her deceased mother. Story 73. When my daughter was 2, she once rocked her dolly and sang this while making direct eye contact with me. "Ring ring a rosy, pocket full of posies. I guess so, the lady's dead." Story 74. My toddler once whispered, "Don't open the door, he's watching," while we were home alone, still recovering emotionally. Story 75. Just 2 days ago, my 3-year-old said that she wants to play in heaven again and stay there forever. Then she told me that her older half-sister also said that she wanted to harm her and me, so maybe that is where she got that idea. Story 76. Less creepy but more depressing. My children have experienced multiple lockdowns at their schools over the years, to the point that they are desensitized to them. It is unsettling to come home from work and hear your 8-year-old daughter casually talk about seeing police officers with their guns drawn while her class was in the storage room. Story 77. It is the middle of the night. My son is in his crib asleep. Suddenly, an Elmo toy in a box started laughing, and then my son started laughing and giggling. Story 78. My daughter, who was probably 11 at the time, and I were playing Pokemon Go. I said, "Oh wow, that's a ghost and water type. That's weird." She casually replied without even looking up, "Not really. People drown all the time." Story 79. Okay, so cheating a little because it was my much younger brother, not my child. But it was always hard to get him to sleep. He fought going to bed like crazy. One night, after he insisted for hours that he just wasn't sleepy, my exasperated mom told him, "Just lie in your bed with your eyes closed until you fall asleep." And this creepy little boy said, I can't close my eyes. When I close my eyes, the man won't stop whispering. Story 80. Our child, from age 4 to age 7, spoke with a perfect British accent. She called us mother and father. It was unsettling. We had to take a DNA test because the school suspected we had stolen a British child. At age 7, she stopped speaking with the British accent and reverted to a rural Southern accent. We asked her why she spoke in a British accent. She said she was just being a princess. We asked why she stopped. She said because princesses are for babies and she was no longer a baby. She is in her 20s now, and her mother and I still call her daughter in our best British accent. Story 81. Walking into a graveyard with my 2-year-old daughter. We had been there before but never told her what it actually was as we just walked through to get home. She said, "Shuh, mummy, bodies are sleeping. Spooky." She repeated it when questioned and then said it was cold there. Needless to say, I rushed her out of there. Story 82. My son was a toddler when my father died. The day after the funeral, my son refused to sleep in his grandmother's room and said that grandfather was there anyway to keep grandmother company. Story 83. My 5-year-old son was terrible at drawing in kindergarten. He absolutely loathed it. One day, he came home with a very elaborate drawing for his age. It showed a house on the left and 4 stick figures. 2 were smaller than the others. One of the children was pointing at the house, and inside its speech bubble was a baby's face. When I asked him about it, he said that my husband and I took him and his best friend for a walk, and then he told us to return because the baby had woken up and was crying. We had been trying for quite some time at that point, but nothing happened. We had practically given up. Fast forward a year and he was right. He is now a very proud and affectionate older brother. It is heartwarming but still gives me chills how he put it on paper. Story 84. We are currently living in my grandparents' old house. My grandpa passed away before my daughter was born, but she did meet my grandma, who passed away just before she turned 2. My daughter met her multiple times and called her Gigi. A few weeks ago, we were sitting in the living room when my daughter said, "Oh, mommy, Gigi is here." At first, I looked outside because she also calls my mom's mom Gigi, and I thought she had come over. My daughter said, "No, mommy, she went upstairs." I asked her who, and she replied, "You know your meme," what I called her. I responded, Okay, cool." Story 85. I want to peel your skin off. I was badly sunburned. Whispered quietly in my ear, "You smell different when you are awake." Story 86. When I was about 14, my dad was a bit drunk and started talking about my grandfather, his father, who passed away well before I was born. It was the usual, "He would have loved you," etc., but he said, "I know he watches you and makes sure you will always be okay." This always stuck with me as my dad doesn't believe in anything like that. Anyway, flash forward about 12 years. My first son was around 2 years old. I was working nights and my wife worked a part-time day job on my nights off. This meant that on the first day I was tired and would nap when or if he did. One time, I woke up on the sofa and he was sitting there playing with his toys. I said, "Oh, sorry, have you been awake long?" My son said, "A while," but the man was playing with me. I asked, "What man?" My son replied, "The old one who makes sure we are okay." I said, "No, what man? Who was here?" He laughed and said, "You're silly, it's Granddad." I said, "Granddad isn't here, he's at his house." My son said, "The other one, the oldest one." It was creepy and yet soothing all at once. Story 87. My 2-year-old said, "Mummy, a cannonball. I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry." He saw the bronze spheres on the ends of the curtain rods in my bedroom. He knows what a cannonball is because of pirates and similar stories. But the repeated, "I am sorry," made me think of past life war flashbacks or something. Story 88. This is not about my child. It is about things my parents said I did as a child that would have really upset me if my child had done them. For some reason, my parents were perfectly fine with me watching Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street when I was about 3 years old. My mom said I walked around singing 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. Then my parents tried to get me to stop sleeping in their bed and to sleep in my own room. In the middle of the night, every night, I would start screaming loudly and saying that Freddy was under my bed. My mom said I would tell her exactly what he was wearing and everything. She made me stop watching Freddy after that. Story 89. After my husband gave me a peck on the cheek. 6-year-old biological daughter. Can I marry your dad? Me, Mom. No, why would you ask me that? Daughter. Because you married mine. Accompanied by a death glare. Story 90. My aunt became concerned when her 3 to 4-year-old was growling something like, "In the name of Lucifer, I command you to spread the blood of the innocent." I suppose watching the movie Little Nicky with him was not a good idea. My apologies. Story 91. Granddad will die in 2 weeks. We will never see him again, said my then 3-year-old. A week later, he was hit by a car and died. She was a week off, but still. She told me a few weeks ago that I will die in September. Story 92. Not my child, but my niece. In our old house, the spare bedroom had an awful feel to it, as if someone was in there. Even in the middle of summer, with the sun streaming through the window for hours, it was always freezing. Once, my brother-in-law was getting changed in there and ran downstairs terrified because the bookcase was shaking violently. My niece, who was 4, used to sleep over quite a lot. One morning, she came to us and asked, "Who is the nasty man in the bedroom?" We moved out when my daughter was 1. Suffice to say, she never moved into that room. Story 93. I was lying in bed with my 5-year-old, who was feverish. All the lights were off and it was completely dark, but the door was cracked open. He said, "Oh, my toddler daughter's name is here." I said, "No, she's not. She's sleeping." We did hear movement and he called out her name a few times. I told him to stop. It was just the cats, and our daughter was sleeping. He said, "Oh, I thought it was daughter," because it was standing up. Instantly, all my hair stood on end. I was so scared I moved both my boys into my room that night. My kids have also talked in their sleep at the same time, which is quite unnerving. Story 94. When my son was about 8 months old, I heard him crying on the baby monitor while I was in the living room. I went to check on him, and as soon as I opened the door, he said, "Help me," in a scared voice. He then fell back asleep immediately. He said it so perfectly, considering he could only make mumbling noises at that stage. This is something I will never forget. Story 95. My son, at 7, looked at me one day and said, "When I'm 10, I'm going to die." Stunned me, of course. I can't remember what I said back to him, but he never mentioned it again. 8 days after his 10th birthday, he wrecked on his bicycle, receiving a traumatic brain injury that effectively ended the child he had been and his future. Story 96. My niece said, "The baby said sorry." I asked, "What baby?" She said, "That baby," and pointed at my belly. I had had a miscarriage the week before. Story 97. Not a parent but have worked with children for nearly 10 years. Worked in daycare with 4 to 5-year-olds. One child said, "I haven't finished growing all my skin yet," which stunned me into silence. Story 98. I was walking from the house to the garage, past my 16-year-old son's bedroom. A glint of metal caught my eye. There was an 8-inch Victorinox chef's knife placed perfectly in line with the long axis of the bed. Puzzled, I decided to remove it and put it back in the knife drawer. I explained to myself that it could be dangerous because sometimes kids like to run into their rooms and jump on their beds. I found my son in the kitchen and asked him what he was doing with the knife. In a creepy, greasy voice that I had never heard from him before, he replied, "Stabbing the mattress." I shuddered and walked away, unable to fully process everything. It was like he was a different person, and the tone of his voice was humorously malevolent. I was so disturbed by this that I blocked it from my memory. After a series of disturbing behaviors on his part, I removed his sister from the house and we went to stay with relatives while he remained with his mother. I related this story to her a few weeks later, and she turned to me and screamed, "Dad, why didn't you tell me about this? He's been saying he wants to kill you for months." I then went back to the house to see. He had indeed been stabbing his foam-topped mattress. It was invisible except when you bent the foam. I discovered dozens of stab marks. To this day, I don't know why I didn't immediately inspect the mattress or tell anyone else about it for weeks. I think I just dissociated. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.